Thank you so much. This is very, very exciting. It's my first time in South Africa. I'm just going to read a little bit and then we're going to have a dialogue. Before I start, let me just say that I have presented my work internationally, and everywhere I go, white people say, well, it's different here, and you're not from here, and so you don't know, and this doesn't apply to us, and racism is an American problem. Yeah. And everywhere I go, in those same places, people of color say to me, oh my God, come over here and help us with these white people. Everything you're saying is exactly what we're experiencing. So while I don't have every nuance and complexity of your context, what I'm going to be describing is familiar, and I would put it on you to make those translations rather than to reject out of hand, because there are some variations. The outcome is consistent, and that is racial inequality that benefits white people. All right, I am a white woman. I am standing beside a black woman. We are facing a group of white people seated in front of us. We are in their workplace and have been hired by their employer to lead them in a dialogue about race. The room is filled with tension and charged with hostility. I have just presented a definition of racism that includes the acknowledgement that white people hold social and institutional power over people of color. A white man is pounding his fist on the table. As he pounds, he yells, "A white person can't get a job anymore." I look around the room and see 40 employees, 38 of whom are white. Why is this white man so angry? Why is he being so careless about the impact of his anger? Why doesn't he notice the effect this outburst is having on the few people of color in the room? Why are all the other white people either sitting in silent agreement with him or tuning out? I have, after all, only articulated a definition of racism. So white people in white settler colonial contexts, such as the one we are in now, live in a society that is deeply separate and unequal by race. And white people are the beneficiaries of that separation and inequality. As a result, we are insulated from racial stress at the same time that we come to feel entitled to and deserving of our advantage. Given how seldom we experience racial discomfort in a society we dominate, we haven't had to build our racial stamina. Socialized into a deeply internalized sense of superiority that we either are unaware of or can never admit to ourselves, we become highly fragile in conversations about race. We consider a challenge to our racial worldviews as a challenge to our very identities as good, moral people. Thus, we perceive any attempt to connect us to the system of racism as an unsettling and unfair moral offense. The smallest amount of racial stress is intolerable. The mere suggestion that being white has meaning often, much less generalizing about white people. So heads up, everybody. I'm going to generalize about white people all night long. And every white person in this room is going to be just fine. All right. The mere suggestion that being white has meaning often triggers a range of defensive responses. These include emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal from the stress-inducing situation. These responses work to reinstate white equilibrium as they repel the challenge, return our racial comfort, and maintain our dominance within the racial hierarchy. I conceptualize this process as white fragility. Though white fragility is triggered by discomfort and anxiety, it is born of superiority and entitlement. White fragility is not weakness per se. In fact, it is a powerful means of white racial control and the protection of white advantage. I'm just going to read two more relatively short pieces. And one was, what leads up to this passage is that when I first applied for a job leading primarily white people in dialogues about racism, side by side with people of color, I thought I was qualified to do that because I was a vegetarian, so how could I be racist? So when I first applied for this job, and of course I wasn't qualified for it, but I'm white, so I got it. I always wonder if people of color ever are astounded at the mediocrity that white people get away with. And I was unprepared for the kind of responses that I just read to you. And yet over time, it was so predictable, so consistent, almost scripted. And right now, I've been in South Africa for 1 week, and I can give you your scripts back to you too. Many of them are the same, and there's a huge difference. Like, for example, we don't say I built townships. I've built houses in townships for Habitat for Humanity, so I'm not racist. We have similar things that we say. And I eventually began to see how this worked. I began to see what I think of as the pillars of whiteness, the unexamined beliefs that prop up our racial responses. I could see the power of the belief that only bad people were racist, as well as how individualism allowed white people to exempt themselves from the forces of socialization. I could see how we are taught to think about racism only as discrete acts committed by individual people rather than as a complex, interrelated system. And in light of so many white expressions of resentment toward people of color, I realized that we see ourselves as entitled to and deserving of more than people of color deserve. I saw our investment in a system that serves us. I also saw how hard we work to deny all of this and how defensive we become when these dynamics were named. In turn, I saw how our defensiveness maintained the racial status quo. Personal reflections on my own racism, a more critical view of media and other aspects of culture, and exposure to the perspectives of many brilliant and patient mentors of color all helped me to see how these pillars of racism worked. It became clear that if I believed that only bad people who intended to hurt others because of race could ever do so, I would respond with outrage to any suggestion that I was involved in racism. Of course that belief would make me feel falsely accused of something terrible, and of course I would want to defend my character, and I had certainly had many of my own moments of responding in just those ways to reflect on. I came to see that the way we are taught to define racism makes it virtually impossible for white people to understand it. Given our racial insulation coupled with misinformation, any suggestion that we are complicit in racism is a kind of unwelcome and insulting shock to the system. So just one last little anecdote about a conversation. And this for me illustrates how we do race, if you will, right? How white people, through our narratives, reproduce racism. Consider a conversation I had with a white friend. She was telling me about a white couple she knew who had just moved to New Orleans and bought a house for a mere $25,000. Of course, she immediately added, they also had to buy a gun, and Joan is afraid to leave the house. I immediately knew they had bought a home in a black neighborhood. This was a moment of white racial bonding between this couple who shared the story of racial danger and my friend, and then between my friend and me as she repeated the story. Through this tale, the four of us fortified familiar images of the horror of black space and drew boundaries between us and them without ever having to directly name race or openly express our disdain for black space. Notice that the need for a gun is a key part of this story. It would not have the degree of social capital it holds if the emphasis were on the price of the house alone. Rather, the story's emotional power rests on why a house would be that cheap. Because it is in a black neighborhood where white people literally might not get out alive. Yet while very negative and stereotypical representations of blacks were reinforced in that exchange, not naming race provided plausible deniability. In fact, in preparing to share this incident, I texted my friend and asked her the name of the city her friends had moved to. I also wanted to confirm my assumption that she was talking about a black neighborhood. I share the text exchange here. Hey, what city did you say your friends had bought a house in for $25,000? She responds, New Orleans. They said they live in a very bad neighborhood and they each have to have a gun to protect themselves. I wouldn't pay 5 cents for that neighborhood. I replied, I assume it's a black neighborhood? She says, yes, you get what you pay for. I'd rather pay $500,000 and live somewhere where I wasn't afraid. And then I respond, I wasn't asking because I want to live there. I'm writing about this in my book, the way that white people talk about the way that white people talk about race without ever coming out and talking about race. And she replies, I wouldn't want you to live there, it's too far away from me. Notice that when I simply ask what city the house is in, she repeats the story about the neighborhood being so bad that her friends need guns. When I ask if the neighborhood is black, she's comfortable confirming that it is. But when I tell her that I'm interested in how whites talk about race without talking about race, she switches the narrative. Now her concern is about not wanting me to live so far away. This is a classic example of aversive racism, holding deep racial disdain that surfaces in daily discourse, but not being able to admit it because the disdain conflicts with our self-image and professed beliefs. And this is one of the reasons why I think white progressives, which I suspect I'm sitting in front of a room full of, this is one of the reasons why I think we can be the most difficult. Because to the degree that our identities are rooted in this idea of progressiveness and non-racist, we're going to be in denial and also incredibly defensive at any suggestion to the contrary. And so in that way, I think we cause the most daily hostility for people of color living and interacting in primarily white space. All right.
Thank you. Let's give a round of applause. I've not had the opportunity to welcome you to Cape Town, so I will welcome you to the place that is called Au. It's the Christian word for place where clouds gather in Cape Town. And we are sitting at the foot of Table Mountain, and that is known as Morikwach, the stone in the ocean. So, welcome to Morikwach. Your book can be described as red hot, but in the context, I guess it's white hot. Pun intended, of course. I thought, having gone through the book, that your title was a bit misplaced. He says tongue-in-cheek. Perhaps a more useful title would have been Unmasking White Racism. That might have been too close to feminist, unmasking of things. Or Inside the White Mind. And as I read it, I felt like a fly on the wall, listening to a conversation to an insider group, trying to grapple with what does it mean to be white in the world. And so you unpack a lot of that. And one of the aspects thereof is what I want you to take you to, and that is the normativeness attached to whiteness. And that becomes the benchmark for measuring civilization, standards, performance, and behavior. And you explain that at length. Would you like to take us there?
So, we are in right now a white supremacist culture. And that is a very charged term. I imagine it's charged here. It's certainly a charged term in the US because we associate white supremacists with people wearing, at least in my context, white hoods. What I call avowed racist. I'm not an avowed racist. I'm clear that I have been socialized into a racist worldview. I have developed racial biases. I have, as a result, patterns of racism, and I have investments in racism. And I seek to challenge that condition. So I'm not an avowed racist, but they're out there, and we tend to think of those as the white supremacists. Sociologists understand white supremacy as a highly descriptive term for the societies that we live in. Societies that hold white people as the ideal for humanity, as the human norm. and every other kind of person a particular variation and a defective or deficient variation of that norm. And the example I often give is that of the 100 top grossing films of all time, disseminated worldwide, and everywhere I go, everyone's consuming American films. So we have all been deeply shaped by the stories in films, the representation in films. And of the 100 top grossing films, 99 were directed by men and 95 of them white. That is a deeply homogeneous group that I can tell you lives segregated lives and yet gets to represent the other when they do not know the other, when they are not in relationship with the other. And they get to do that and position their perspective on themselves and the other as simply a universal human viewpoint. What Richard Dyer is a film critic, and he calls that the God trick. You know, you're just this disembodied voice proclaiming reality, right, from up above. So that Mike Lee is a filmmaker who makes films about the human condition, and Spike Lee is a black filmmaker who makes films about black issues. And by always marking what is not white and not marking white, we grant white people several things: objectivity, individuality, and also universality. We both get to be seen as unique and special and different, and also capable of speaking for everybody. And to be able to disseminate your worldview is a key aspect of power and of systemic racism. So those are some of the ways in which the white body, if you will, and the white experience is positioned as simply human. The image I often show when I have slides is the Sistine Chapel, God creating man. Can you see it in here? That is the best single image for me of white supremacy that I can come up with. And don't forget, you know, the mother of God, also rendered white, who was not white in real life. Just in case you didn't know that.
No, we'll have to disagree with you. God's mother was white, wasn't she? All right, thank you. Let me take you to another place. Your book takes us to spaces that we ordinarily would not go. So it's a bit of a roller coaster ride. We've got to fasten your seatbelt. I'm reading from page 113. Let me also be clear that the term white fragility is intended to describe a very specific white phenomenon. White fragility, you say, is much more than mere defensiveness and whining. It may be conceptualized as the sociology of dominance, an outcome of white people's socialization into white supremacy, and a means to protect, maintain, and reproduce white supremacy. Where I want us to go with this conversation around socialization, both in terms of the early childhood stuff which you cover, and then the reinforcement thereof in adult life. Would you take us there at the level of early childhood socialization, that unconscious socialization that you talk about?
I'm going to start with, for 20 years I've been asking white people, what are some of the ways in which your race has shaped your life? And the most consistent pattern is the inability to answer the question. And the inability to see white space as racial space. Right? And so when they do answer the question, we tend to organize our answers around people of color. So we'll tell a story about a friendship or a relationship. We'll talk about people of color and what we were taught about. This is how white people answer the question, what are some of the ways in which your race has shaped your life? Which of course is not answering that question, right? But it shows how unracialized our identities are. So let me begin to answer it. When my mother was pregnant with me, what environmental safety did she have the choice to carry that pregnancy in? What kind of water soil and air quality was available to my mother as she carried me? What kind of nutrition was available to my mother when she carried me? What kind of sanitation services were available to her? What kind of education and transportation? Where did my mother deliver me, and how was she treated in the hospital during my delivery? A recent study, while the studies I'm going to name are U.S. studies, I cannot imagine they're not relevant here, or that there may be similar studies here. A recent study of medical researchers showed that over 50% believe that Black people feel less pain. Now that on one hand is a horrifying belief, and on the other I understand why we have that belief, because we live such segregated lives. And so we're left to rely on these consistent and narrow representations of hyper-athleticism, hyper-animalism, hyper-physicality, hyper-intuitiveness, those kinds of things. And yet that belief that Black people feel less pain impacted how my white mother's labor was managed. Who delivered me? Who owned the hospital I was delivered in? And who came in that night, mopped the floor, took out the trash, and washed the sheets? I was born into a racial hierarchy, the forces of which have been operating on my life since before I took my first breath, so that we could, and we could predict whether my mother and I were going to survive my birth. And we could predict how long I'm going to live. Now, getting in touch with that is not so I can see what a bad person I am, but because I bring all of that consciousness to the table, or lack thereof, that consciousness to the table, where decisions are being made that impact the lives of those not sitting at the table. And the research is clear that by age 3 to 4, all children, everyone in this room by age 3 to 4 understood that it's better to be white. No one in this room missed that message. And this is not an isolated message dependent on some mean person. It circulates 24/7, 365. It's better to be white. Who doesn't know that in these societies? And the image I show for that is Frozen, the two girls. Now, the impact of that message is different depending on whether you are white, but we've all been shaped by that message. We have often deal with it where no one was exempt from it, right? I guess those are some of the ways in which I think we are socialized into our places. And I just have to say, every moment that I am sitting down being served by Black people in your country, we are all being reinforced in our positions. This is happening. I don't ever have to say the N word or the K word to be constantly reinforced in my place and your place. And if I refuse to look at it, I cannot resist it.
Thank you. Take us from that personal, very personal experience to what you talk about at the level of institutional power and the embeddedness of inequality. Famous Congress.
So I have this slide that I use. I need to talk about anti-Blackness.
That's the challenge.
So when I first started this, you get a lot. You stand up and speak openly about race, you get a lot of feedback. And I used to try to be so careful not to make it just a black and white issue, because this is one of the pieces of feedback you'll get. You know, what about other groups, etc. I have come to a place where I actually feel comfortable about to say the following. All peoples who are not perceived or defined as white experience racism. And they experience it in ways that would be shared among and recognized across their different racial groups. And they also experience it in ways that are specific to their racial group. For example, what's in my head about Asian people is different than what's in my head about Black people, which is different than what's in my head about Indigenous peoples. I have different levels of comfort, and therefore those groups have different experiences. In the US, we talk about Asian people, not to deny that they experience racism, but that in some ways they are honorary whites or white adjacent. And so they have a different experience under this construct. So you have to also break that down and understand how different groups are set up. Having said that, I feel very clear at this point in my work that there is something profoundly anti-Black that circulates globally. And in the white mind, Black people are the ultimate racial other. And anti-Blackness also cuts across, this is going in and out, I don't know if this has to do with how pleasant, but anti-Blackness cuts across all groups, including among Black people. Sometimes called colorism. The darker you are, the more compounded is the oppression, right? And so to illustrate that point, to illustrate anti-Blackness, the systemic nature of racism, that it is not in the past, that we have to know our history, that we have to be able to trace the history into the present. I show this slide that starts with 300 years of kidnapping, rape, torture, brutality, and enslavement. And it carries on all the way down until the present time. That one's better. And go smooth. And about a quarter of the way into this really dense slide, I say, and bans on testifying against whites, which made it technically legal to murder Black people in the US. And a quarter of the way into this slide is just filled with examples of systemic racism here in my lifetime. This idea in the US that racism ended when enslavement ended is absurd. And I think we can see today that despite having had a Black president, we are so not post-racial, that we are back in the 60s. And so I want to make this point. To be in this culture, when apartheid was happening in almost every person in this room's life, and to say get over it has been the cruelest, most shocking thing that I have heard since I've been in South Africa.
I'm going to take you to that slide we just talked about. And I've written the term here, the crimes of whiteness. And you catalogue them. And often we don't go there, because we don't associate cruelty with the enforcement of white privilege. But instead we associate white privilege out of an intellectual understanding of the superiority of being. And so that gut-based animal instinct that has been used to entrench white privilege or whiteness we talk about. And those of you that have the book, it's catalogued on page 59. Just take us back there.
Well, I don't know if this is exactly connected to what you're asking, but it came to my mind as that is. There is no white without Black. There is no superiority without inferiority. White people need Black people as the backdrop against which we rise, to project our sins onto, quite frankly. To say that Black people are lazy, to say that Black people are not intelligent, to say that Black people are irrational about race and play the race card. These are outrageous projections of white people's stuff, right? And so when there's an investment, if you will. I'm sometimes asked if I think there could ever be a positive white identity, and honestly I don't. Because white is a construct of white supremacy. It didn't exist before we needed it to justify colonialism and enslavement. Ta-Nehisi Coates and also Ibram Kendi. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a Black scholar, and he says, racism is the parent, race is the child. Because a lot of us think, oh, well, it's natural to be afraid of difference and that's all this is. No. You start with the resources of a group of people that you want. You want the resources, you have the means to take the resources. and then you make up a story to justify taking the resources. So race is the story we made up to justify colonialism and enslavement, right? And so some of those crimes that I actually call it state-sanctioned organized crime. Every day that I'm here, I get better at tweaking my slideshow for your context. So I took the slide that I have of the U.S. context, and I put in red all of the pieces that are the same, right?
It's one big red slide.
It's pretty much. I mean, I don't know, and actually I can ask, I don't know if forced sterilizations, medical experimentations happened here. Okay, well, I'm going to get those red. The school to prison pipeline, mass incarceration, differential school funding, biased media, biased policing, biased education, biased employment, right? Cultural
Just
mockery.
ignore the crowd. They're confused.
Cultural mockery. Historical omissions. And unaddressed trauma. Okay? So it is very, very similar.